In the grim lexicon of the Second World War, certain names have become synonymous with organized atrocity. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads that swept through the East, murdering over 1 million people in cold blood. The Waffen-SS, the political soldiers of the Nazi Party, whose fanaticism and brutality on the battlefield were matched only by their role in administering the camps. These organizations represent a baseline of understood evil, a benchmark for the horrors that the Nazi regime systematically unleashed upon the world. They are the perpetrators we know, the faces of a genocide. But what if there was another category of evil? A unit so steeped in sadism, so pathologically violent, that its actions provoked disgust and horror even among the hardened commanders of the SS? What if there existed a formation whose depravity was so extreme that it operated outside all conventions of war, even the twisted conventions of the Nazi War of Annihilation? Such a unit did exist, and its story represents a descent into a circle of hell that is almost entirely unknown, a journey into an abyss within the abyss of the Eastern Front. August 5, 1944. The city of Warsaw is a cauldron of fire and smoke. The Polish Home Army has risen up against its German occupiers, and the response from the Reich is one of unrestrained fury. The order from Heinrich Himmler is explicit: Warsaw is to be razed to the ground, its inhabitants exterminated. To carry out this order, some of the most brutal units in the German arsenal are brought in. But among them is one particular formation that even its allies watch with a mixture of awe and revulsion. An SS general, the man in overall command of the German suppression, would later write of what he witnessed. He described not soldiers, but a drunken mob. He wrote of seeing women and children being herded into a hospital, the doors being barred, and the building then set alight. He wrote of public rapes, of infants being bayoneted, of a gleeful, celebratory sadism that had no military purpose whatsoever. He was not describing the actions of the enemy. He was describing the men of the SS-Sonderregiment, Dirlewanger. This was the Dirlewanger Brigade, an entity unique in the annals of modern warfare. It was not an elite military formation. It was a penal battalion, a state-sanctioned concentration of the Reich's most irredeemable and violent criminals. Its ranks were filled not with soldiers, but with convicted poachers, murderers, arsonists, rapists, and the clinically insane, released from prisons and asylums and handed a uniform. And at their head was a commander perfectly suited to lead them, Dr. Oskar Dirlewanger, a decorated veteran of the First World War, but also a convicted child rapist, a violent alcoholic, and a sadist of legendary cruelty. He was a man who had been given command of an army built in his own image. This documentary will tell the story of that unit, how it was created, the unspeakable path of destruction it carved across Eastern Europe, and how a regime built on a foundation of inhumanity could spawn a monster that would shock even itself. The story of the Dirlewanger Brigade is inseparable from the story of its founder and commander, a man whose personal history is a case study in the moral rot that festered at the core of the Nazi movement. Oskar Dirlewanger was not a simple brute. He was a man of chilling paradoxes, a holder of a doctorate in political science from the University of Frankfurt, and a twice-convicted child rapist. He was a highly decorated combat veteran of the First World War, earning the Iron Cross first and second class, yet his defining traits were not bravery, but a boundless capacity for sadism and a predatory instinct for cruelty. He was the personification of the Nazi regime's ability to harness the most degenerate elements of society and elevate them to positions of terrifying power. Dirlewanger's journey into the abyss began after the First World War, where he, like many disaffected veterans, joined the ranks of the Freikorps, the right-wing paramilitary groups that waged a brutal street war against communists and Democrats in the dying days of the Weimar Republic. It was here that he honed his skills in irregular warfare and developed a reputation for extreme violence, and more importantly, it was here that he forged connections with other like-minded men who would later rise to prominence in the SS. He joined the Nazi Party early, in 1923, and was an active participant in its thuggish rise to power. But it was his private life that truly revealed the depths of his depravity. In 1934, he was convicted of the statutory rape of a 14-year-old girl from the League of German Girls. He was stripped of his academic degree, expelled from the party, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. After his release, he was arrested and convicted again on similar charges and sent to a concentration camp, not as a guard, but as an inmate. For any normal man, this would have been the end. But Dirlewanger was a master of leveraging his connections. From inside the camp, he reached out to an old Freikorps comrade who had become one of the most powerful and feared men in the Nazi state, Gottlob Berger, the head of the SS main office. Berger, a man who valued loyalty and ruthlessness above all else, saw in Dirlewanger not a degenerate criminal, but a useful instrument. Through Berger's direct intervention, Dirlewanger's case was reopened, his conviction was overturned on a technicality, and he was reinstated into the party. Berger then arranged for his protégé to rehabilitate himself by volunteering for the Condor Legion, the German expeditionary force fighting in the Spanish Civil War. In Spain, Dirlewanger once again proved his capacity for brutality, was wounded 3 times, and returned to Germany a redeemed man in the eyes of his powerful patrons. He was a convicted pedophile who had been not just forgiven, but laundered by the Nazi system, a human weapon waiting to be aimed. The weapon that Gottlob Berger would create for his protégé was born from a uniquely Nazi blend of pragmatism and ideology. By 1940, the German occupation of Poland had created a new and persistent problem for the Reich: partisans, poachers, and resistance fighters operating in the dense forests. Heinrich Himmler, ever obsessed with unconventional threats, believed that the army was ill-equipped to handle this kind of irregular warfare. He needed a specialized unit, a team of expert hunters and trackers who could operate outside the normal military structure. It was in this context that Berger saw his opportunity to fully rehabilitate Dirlewanger. He proposed to Himmler the creation of a new Sonderkommando, or special unit, to be commanded by Dirlewanger. The most radical and defining feature of this new unit was the composition of its recruits. Berger's proposal was as simple as it was depraved. Who better to hunt poachers than other poachers? Under this new directive, men who had been convicted of poaching offenses and were serving time in Germany's prisons and concentration camps were offered a deal. They could have their sentences commuted and their civil rights restored if they agreed to volunteer for service in this new anti-partisan unit. The official name was the Wildeab Kommando Oranienburg, the Poachers Commando of Oranienburg. Unofficially, it would become known as the Dirlewanger Unit. It was, from its very inception, a penal battalion, a unit composed entirely of convicted criminals, granted the full authority of the SS and unleashed upon the occupied territories. The initial cohort of a few dozen convicted poachers soon proved the concept's brutal effectiveness in the eyes of Himmler. They were skilled trackers, they knew the forests, and they operated with a complete lack of military discipline or moral restraint. Their methods were savage and effective. But the small number of poachers was insufficient for the scale of the pacification campaigns envisioned by the SS. And so, the recruiting pool was widened. Soon, the Dirlewanger unit was accepting not just poachers, but men convicted of more serious violent crimes: assault, robbery, arson, and murder. As the war on the Eastern Front began in 1941, the demand for this kind of brutal, terror-based warfare grew, and the unit expanded accordingly. The final, decisive step in the unit's evolution into a true brigade of devils came as its casualties mounted. To replenish its ranks, the floodgates were opened completely. The unit began to accept not just German criminals, but also Ukrainian and Russian collaborators, former Red Army prisoners who were willing to do anything to escape the horrors of the German POW camps. And most chillingly, it began to draw its recruits from the ranks of men who had been deemed mentally and morally unfit for any other form of service, men held in asylums and military prisons for the most extreme and pathological behaviors. It became a magnet for sadists, psychopaths, and the criminally insane. It was no longer a unit of poachers. It had become a concentrated, weaponized collection of the most degenerate and violent men the Third Reich could find, led by a commander who was their perfect reflection. In the summer of 1942, the Dirlewanger unit, now expanded to battalion strength, was formally unleashed upon the Eastern Front. Its designated area of operations was Belarus, a region of dense forests, vast swamps, and fervent partisan activity. Its official mission was Bandenbekämpfung, bandit fighting. In reality, this was a bureaucratic euphemism for a war of annihilation, a campaign of terror waged not just against the partisans themselves, but against the entire civilian population that was deemed to be supporting them. For Oskar Dirlewanger and his men, this was not a military assignment. It was a license to indulge in their most depraved impulses on an industrial scale. The history of the Dirlewanger Brigade in Belarus is not a record of battles. It is a catalogue of systematic, assembly-line atrocities. The unit's standard operating procedure was a brutal and repetitive ritual of mass murder. Upon entering a village suspected of harboring or aiding partisans, Dirlewanger's men would round up the entire population. There was no attempt to distinguish between combatants and civilians, between men, women, and children. The process was one of collective punishment in its most extreme form. The able-bodied men and women would be marched away to be used as slave labor or would simply be shot on the spot. The rest of the villagers, the elderly, the women, the children, and the infants, would be herded into a large building, typically a barn, a church, or a schoolhouse. The doors would be barricaded from the outside. What followed was a scene of almost unimaginable horror, repeated in scores of villages across the Belarusian countryside. The Dirlewanger men, often fueled by vast quantities of alcohol, would set the building on fire. As the structure was consumed by flames, anyone who attempted to escape through a window or a crack in the wall would be mercilessly machine-gunned for sport. The soldiers would stand around the burning building, listening to the screams of the dying, often while playing music on accordions, turning the mass murder of hundreds of human beings into a grotesque, celebratory festival. This was not an occasional act of rage. This was their primary tactical method. In one such operation, codenamed Operation Cottbus, the unit recorded the killing of nearly 10,000 bandits, while recovering only around 1,000 actual weapons. The vast majority of their victims were unarmed civilians. These actions were so extreme that they began to attract the horrified attention of other German units in the area. Wehrmacht and even some SS commanders began to send frantic, secret reports back to Berlin, complaining that Dirlewanger's methods were not just barbaric, but counterproductive. They argued that his unit's penchant for mass rape, mindless slaughter, and drunken pillaging was driving the local population into the arms of the partisans and making the pacification of the region impossible. But these complaints were almost always suppressed. Dirlewanger was protected. His powerful patron, Gottlob Berger, ensured that any official inquiries were quashed. Heinrich Himmler himself, the architect of the Holocaust, saw in Dirlewanger's unit the perfect instrument for his scorched earth policies. The Dirlewanger Brigade was not a rogue unit, it was the ultimate, logical expression of the Nazi regime's war of racial extermination. By the summer of 1944, the tide of the war on the Eastern Front had turned into a tidal wave. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet summer offensive, had shattered the German Army Group Center, annihilating dozens of divisions and carving a colossal hole in the German front lines. As the Red Army advanced relentlessly towards Warsaw, the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, saw its moment. On August 1, 1944, in a desperate bid to liberate their capital before the Soviets arrived, they launched the Warsaw Uprising. It was an act of breathtaking courage, but it would unleash upon the city a storm of retaliatory fury that would descend into one of the most horrific episodes of urban warfare in modern history. Heinrich Himmler, now in command of the rear areas, was personally enraged by the uprising. He saw it not as a military battle, but as an act of subhuman defiance that had to be crushed with absolute, terrorizing force. He issued an order that was a clear and unambiguous command for genocide. The city was to be leveled, and every single inhabitant, combatant or not, was to be killed. To carry out this order, he assembled a collection of the most brutal and morally compromised units available to the Reich. And at the very top of his list was the one unit he knew would execute his orders without question and with unmatched enthusiasm, the Dirlewanger Brigade. Now expanded to the size of a regiment and reinforced with even more hardened criminals released from military prisons, the Dirlewanger unit was moved from Belarus and thrown into the fighting for Warsaw's Walla district. For Dirlewanger and his men, Himmler's order was not a grim duty, it was a dream come true. It was the ultimate license to kill, to rape, and to plunder, with no restrictions and with the full, explicit blessing of the highest authority in the SS. The atrocities that had characterized their anti-partisan operations in the countryside were now brought into the densely populated streets of a major European capital, and their savagery reached a new, almost unimaginable crescendo. What followed is known in Polish history as the Walla Massacre. Over the course of several days, the Dirlewanger Brigade, along with other German police and collaborationist units, engaged in a systematic orgy of murder that has few parallels. They swept through the district, house by house, and killed everyone and everything they found. They shot civilians in the streets, in their homes, and in their hospital beds. Eyewitness accounts, later verified in post-war trials, speak of nurses being gang-raped and then hung, of pregnant women being bayoneted in the stomach, and of children being used for target practice. In the Walla and St. Lazarus hospitals, they murdered hundreds of doctors and patients. They herded tens of thousands of civilians into the district's cemeteries and public squares and machine-gunned them in mass executions. In less than 2 weeks, it is estimated that the Dirlewanger unit and its associated forces murdered between 40,000 and 50,000 unarmed Polish civilians in the Walla district alone. It was not a battle. It was a meticulously organized slaughter, a depraved festival of death conducted by men who had been handpicked for their very lack of humanity. The actions of the Dirlewanger Brigade in the Walla district were so extreme, so pathologically sadistic, that they breached a threshold of horror that shocked even the most battle-hardened and morally callous of their own commanders. The man in overall command of the German forces suppressing the uprising was SS-Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, an SS general with a long and bloody history of commanding anti-partisan operations himself. He was no stranger to brutality, but what he witnessed in Warsaw filled him with a mixture of professional disgust and genuine alarm. He saw in Dirlewanger not a soldier, but a deranged butcher whose actions were creating a vortex of pure, nihilistic chaos. Von dem Bach-Zelewski and other senior German commanders on the scene, including General Heinz Guderian, the Army Chief of Staff, began to send frantic messages back to Berlin. Their objections were not based on any sense of moral outrage for the Polish victims. Their concerns were purely pragmatic. They reported that Dirlewanger's men were in a near-permanent state of alcoholic intoxication. They were not fighting in any coordinated military fashion. They were simply a drunken, homicidal mob, more interested in rape, plunder, and the torture of civilians than in actually suppressing the Polish resistance. Their indiscriminate slaughter was turning the city into a charnel house so horrific that it was stiffening the resolve of the Polish fighters, turning a difficult battle into a protracted, grinding, and incredibly costly siege. Furthermore, the unit's complete lack of discipline was a liability. Dirlewanger's men were notorious for looting, and their plundered goods, furs, jewelry, and alcohol were becoming a source of friction and envy among other German units. Most damningly, von dem Bach-Zelewski was horrified by Dirlewanger's combat tactics. In one infamous incident, Dirlewanger's solution for clearing a hospital complex held by the resistance was to herd a large group of captured women and children in front of his men, using them as living human shields to advance against the Polish positions. This act, while tactically effective, was seen by the professional officers of the Wehrmacht as a grotesque violation of even the most basic soldierly conduct, an act that brought shame upon the German uniform. Faced with this chorus of high-level complaints, Heinrich Himmler was finally forced to act, but not in the way one might expect. He did not disband the unit or court-martial its commander for his blatant war crimes. Instead, he rewarded him. On August 15, 1944, in the midst of the Walla massacre, Oskar Dirlewanger was promoted to the rank of SS-Oberführer, the equivalent of a senior colonel, for his success in Warsaw. Several weeks later, for his role in finally crushing the uprising, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of the Third Reich's highest military honors. The monster that the regime had created was not just tolerated, it was celebrated and decorated at the highest levels. The complaints from the front line had been noted, and the verdict from the leadership of the SS was clear. The Dirlewanger Brigade was performing its function exactly as intended. Following the razing of Warsaw, the Dirlewanger Brigade, now officially designated the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, was a shadow of its former self, having suffered staggering casualties in the brutal street fighting. But the German war machine, now in its death throes, was desperate for any and all manpower. In late 1944, the unit was hastily rebuilt, its ranks once again replenished with a fresh sweep of the Reich's prisons, as well as, for the first time, political prisoners, socialists, communists, and other enemies of the state, released from concentration camps and given the choice between serving under Dirlewanger or facing the gallows. This new, ideologically mixed formation was then sent to the front lines to help quell the Slovak national uprising, where they once again engaged in their signature brand of terror and atrocity against the civilian population. But by early 1945, the strategic situation had become so catastrophic that even a penal unit like the Dirlewanger Brigade was needed to fight as a conventional military force. They were thrown into the desperate battles against the advancing Red Army on the Oder River, northeast of Berlin. Here, for the first time, the men of the Dirlewanger unit were forced to face a modern, well-equipped, and utterly implacable conventional army. The result was a predictable and total collapse. Pitted against Soviet tanks, artillery, and veteran infantry, the brigade's complete lack of military discipline, training, and heavy equipment was brutally exposed. The unit disintegrated almost immediately. Entire formations, particularly those composed of the recently conscripted political prisoners, deserted at the first opportunity, crossing the lines to surrender to the Soviets. The hardened criminal element, loyal only to themselves, also began to melt away, attempting to escape the tightening noose and lose themselves in the chaos of a collapsing Germany. Oskar Dirlewanger himself, ever the opportunist, reportedly suffered a combat wound and used it as an excuse to abandon his post and flee to the rear, leaving the shattered remnants of his command to their fate. The brigade that had terrorized the defenseless for 3 years effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force the moment it was confronted by a real army. The final ignominious end of the Dirlewanger Brigade came in the last days of the war. Its few remaining survivors, scattered across the front, were either killed in the final apocalyptic Battle of Berlin or were captured by the Soviets. For those who fell into Soviet hands, their fate was sealed. Having been identified by their distinctive unit insignia, they were almost all summarily executed on the spot. The Soviets had a long and intimate knowledge of the unit's atrocities in Belarus, and they were in no mood to take prisoners. The hunters had become the hunted, and the perpetrators of 1,000 massacres were finally subjected to the same merciless brutality they had so gleefully inflicted on others. The final chapter in the story of Oskar Dirlewanger himself is shrouded in a fog of conflicting reports and battlefield rumors, a fittingly chaotic and squalid end for a man whose life was a testament to violence and depravity. After abandoning his disintegrating command on the Eastern Front in April 1945, Dirlewanger fled west, hoping to escape the vengeance of the Red Army and lose himself in the flood of refugees and retreating soldiers that choked the roads of a collapsing Germany. He shed his SS uniform, donned civilian clothes, and adopted a false identity, attempting to perform one last act of cowardly self-preservation. But his notoriety, and his distinctive brutal features, made him a marked man. In early June 1945, a month after the official German surrender, Dirlewanger was identified and captured by French soldiers in the town of Altshausen in southern Germany, which was then under French occupation. He was taken to a local prison, which was being run by the French military but guarded by Polish soldiers who were serving with the Allied forces. It was here that the hunters' luck finally ran out. The Polish guards, many of whom had likely lost family and comrades in the Warsaw Uprising, quickly learned the true identity of their high-value prisoner. What happened next was not an official act of justice, but a raw, elemental act of revenge. Over the course of several nights, the Polish guards are reported to have systematically beaten and tortured their infamous captive. According to eyewitness accounts from other prisoners, they took their time, ensuring that the man who had presided over the agony of so many thousands of their countrymen would not have a quick or easy death. On or around the night of June 7, 1945, Oskar Dirlewanger, the decorated war hero, the doctor of political science, the convicted child molester, and the architect of genocide, died in a prison cell at the hands of his former victims. His official cause of death was listed as ill treatment, a sterile, bureaucratic euphemism for a brutal, but perhaps fitting, end. Because of the clandestine nature of his death and the chaos of the immediate post-war period, rumors persisted for years that Dirlewanger had somehow escaped. Sightings of him were reported in the Middle East and South America, a testament to the almost mythical status of his evil. But these were fantasies. In 1960, in an effort to finally quell the rumors, German authorities exhumed his body from an unmarked grave in Altshausen. The dental records were a perfect match. The devil of Warsaw was, and had been for 15 years, well and truly dead. Unlike so many of his Nazi comrades who would escape justice through the Ratlands or live out comfortable lives in post-war Germany, Dirlewanger had received a final, brutal form of battlefield justice, administered not by a court of law, but by the men whose nation he had tried, and failed, to erase from the earth. In the decades following the end of the Second World War, the Federal Republic of Germany embarked upon an unprecedented and deeply painful process of confronting its past, a concept known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung. The trials at Nuremberg, followed by a series of German-led prosecutions of Nazi war criminals, most famously the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, represented a genuine, if incomplete, effort to hold the perpetrators of the regime's crimes to account. The actions of the SS, the Gestapo, and the administrators of the Holocaust were meticulously documented, debated, and legally condemned. A national consensus was forged that the crimes of the Nazi era were a unique and terrible stain on the nation's history, a past that will not pass away. Yet, within this broad and admirable effort, the story of the Dirlewanger Brigade occupied a strange and uncomfortable space. While the unit's actions, particularly its role in the Warsaw Uprising, were well documented in Polish and Soviet archives, for many years within Germany it was relegated to a historical footnote. This was, in part, due to the very nature of the unit itself. It was an anomaly, an outlier that did not fit neatly into the established categories of Nazi perpetrators. It was not a political organization like the SS-Einsatzgruppen, nor was it a part of the regular German army, the Wehrmacht. It was a bizarre, hybrid entity, a penal battalion that blurred the lines between the military, the police, and the criminal underworld. This ambiguity allowed the story to be conveniently marginalized. For those who sought to defend the honor of the regular German soldier, the Dirlewanger Brigade was a perfect scapegoat. Its members were not soldiers, the argument went, they were criminals, degenerates, and social misfits. Their actions, therefore, could be dismissed as the pathological behavior of an aberrant few, an exception that proved the rule of the Wehrmacht's supposedly professional and honorable conduct. The brigade became a useful symbol of concentrated evil, a container into which the worst sins of the war could be poured, thereby absolving the more mainstream military structures of their own complicity in the war of annihilation. However, this comforting narrative willfully ignores the most damning fact of the brigade's existence. The Dirlewanger unit was not a rogue element that operated in defiance of the Nazi state. It was a deliberate creation of that state, sanctioned, supplied, and celebrated at the highest levels. Oskar Dirlewanger was not a lone monster. He was a tool, personally selected and protected by the leadership of the SS. His unit's methods were not an aberration. They were the most extreme and literal application of the regime's own exterminatory ideology. The story of the Dirlewanger Brigade is therefore not the story of an exception. It is the story of the Nazi regime's core principles, stripped of all pretense of military convention and revealed in their purest, most nihilistic, and most murderous form. It is the story of a system that did not just tolerate monsters, but actively cultivated and weaponized them. The legacy of the Dirlewanger Brigade is not to be found in the ruins of the buildings it destroyed or the battlefields it fought on. Its true, enduring legacy is far more insidious. It is a legacy that challenges one of the most persistent and fiercely defended myths to emerge from the ashes of the Second World War, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. This is the post-war narrative, popular in some German circles and among certain military historians, that the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, was a professional, honorable fighting force that was largely separate from the ideological crimes of the Nazi Party and the SS. According to this myth, the army fought a hard but clean war, and the atrocities were the exclusive domain of Himmler's fanatical black-shirt killers. The story of the Dirlewanger Brigade utterly demolishes this comforting falsehood. The unit, while eventually given an SS designation, was for most of its existence a hybrid entity, armed and supplied by the Wehrmacht and often operating under the Army's tactical command during major anti-partisan operations. Wehrmacht generals were aware of its methods, and while some objected on pragmatic grounds, the Army as an institution continued to cooperate with and enable its campaign of slaughter. The brigade's existence proves that the German war effort was not neatly divided into good soldiers and bad Nazis. It was a single, integrated war of annihilation, in which the lines between military operations and genocidal campaigns were deliberately and systematically blurred. Furthermore, Dirlewanger's initial mission, Bandenbekämpfung, was not unique to his unit. The brutal war against partisans, and the accompanying mass reprisals against civilians, was a standard feature of the German war on the Eastern Front, practiced by the Wehrmacht and the SS alike. The infamous Commissar Order, which commanded the summary execution of all captured Soviet political officers, was issued to and carried out by the army, not the SS. The Dirlewanger Brigade was not an anomaly in its function. It was merely an anomaly in the extremity of its methods and the composition of its personnel. It represents not a deviation from the Wehrmacht's war, but the logical endpoint of it, the place where the thin veneer of military professionalism was stripped away to reveal the purely exterminatory impulse beneath. Therefore, to study the Dirlewanger Brigade is to confront the inseparable nature of the Holocaust and the German military campaign in the East. The unit was a tool designed to pacify the rear areas, to terrorize the population into submission, and to clear the land for German colonization, the very same objectives that drove the larger policies of the Nazi regime. They were the most grotesque and pathological instrument of a fundamentally genocidal policy. Their story serves as a permanent, irrefutable rebuttal to any attempt to sanitize the history of the Wehrmacht. They are a reminder that the evil of the Third Reich was not confined to a few fanatical organizations, but was a pervasive, systemic rot that implicated the entire German war machine. In the final analysis, the story of the Dirlewanger Brigade forces us to venture into the darkest corners of human behavior, to a place where the conventional frameworks of war, strategy, and even ideology begin to break down. It is a story that is profoundly disturbing, not just because of the scale of the atrocities, but because of what it reveals about the nature of evil itself. The men of this unit were not, for the most part, fanatics driven by a complex political or racial ideology in the same way as the elite of the SS. They were something far more primal, and perhaps far more terrifying. They were men who killed for pleasure. The Dirlewanger Brigade represents a unique and horrifying case study in what can happen when a state deliberately harnesses and weaponizes the most antisocial and pathological elements of its society. It was a grand, evil experiment in unleashing the human ID. Dirlewanger and his inner circle were not just war criminals, they were serial killers, given an army and a state-sanctioned hunting ground. Their actions in Belarus and Warsaw were not driven by a coherent military or political objective. They were driven by a lust for cruelty, for power, and for the absolute domination of the helpless. The rapes, the torture, the burning of hospitals, these were not means to an end, they were the end in itself. For these men, the war was the ultimate opportunity to act out their most depraved fantasies without consequence. This narrative shatters any simplistic understanding of the perpetrators of the Holocaust and the War of Annihilation. It demonstrates that the Nazi regime's evil was multifaceted. It was not just the cold bureaucratic evil of Adolf Eichmann, the desk murderer who organized the trains to Auschwitz. It was not just the fanatical, ideological evil of the SS guards who believed they were cleansing the world of subhumans. It was also the raw, nihilistic, and purely sadistic evil of Oskar Dirlewanger and his men, who likely cared little for the grand theories of racial purity, but who reveled in the act of inflicting pain. This makes their story a deeply uncomfortable one. It is easier to comprehend evil that is attached to a clear, albeit monstrous, ideology. It is harder to confront an evil that is seemingly an end in itself, an evil that appears to be rooted in the simple, terrifying joy of cruelty. The Dirlewanger Brigade is a reminder that within any society, there exists a dark potential, a capacity for violence and sadism that is normally kept in check by the structures of law and civilization. Their story is the story of what happens when a state decides to not just remove those checks, but to actively reward and encourage the very worst of human nature. It is a journey to the 0 point of human morality. Why is it imperative that this horrific story, the story of the Dirlewanger Brigade, be told? Why must we, as students of history, force ourselves to gaze into this particular abyss, to document a saga of such unrelenting and seemingly gratuitous depravity? We must do so not in spite of its horror, but because of it. To ignore the story of the Dirlewanger Brigade is to allow an incomplete and dangerously sanitized version of the Second World War to persist. It is to accept the comforting myths and to turn away from the most difficult and profound truths of the conflict. The story of Oskar Dirlewanger and his men serves as a permanent and necessary inoculation against the romanticization of war. It is a brutal, visceral refutation of any notion of a clean fight or a soldier's honor existing in a vacuum, separate from the political and moral context of the conflict. It reminds us that war is not just a clash of armies, but a force that can dissolve the very foundations of human morality, unleashing pathologies that are unimaginable in peacetime. The men of this unit were not noble warriors, they were the ugliest reflection of a regime that had declared war on humanity itself. Furthermore, their story is a vital and damning piece of evidence in the ongoing fight against historical revisionism. It stands as an unassailable monument to the true nature of the German war on the Eastern Front. It makes it impossible to argue that the Wehrmacht was somehow separate from the crimes of the SS, or that the war against partisans was a conventional military operation. The Dirlewanger Brigade is the point at which all such arguments collapse, the place where the genocidal intent of the Nazi regime is laid bare in its most raw and undeniable form. To remember Dirlewanger is to build a fortress of fact against the lies and distortions of those who would seek to rehabilitate the reputation of the Third Reich. But most importantly, we must tell this story to honor the memory of its victims. The tens of thousands of nameless men, women, and children who were butchered in the villages of Belarus and the streets of Warsaw were not casualties of war in any conventional sense. They were the victims of a calculated, state-sanctioned campaign of human extermination, carried out by men who were the dregs of their own society. Their suffering was absolute, and for many years, their story was buried, an inconvenient and messy footnote in the grand narrative of the war. By telling their story, by documenting the full, unflinching horror of what was done to them, we refuse to allow their deaths to be meaningless. We restore to them the humanity that their killers sought to deny them. We bear witness. And in the study of history, bearing witness to the truth, no matter how dark, is the most sacred duty of all.